Sherlock Holmes and the Devil's Manuscript, a Baker Street occult conspiracy. Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet corner of the night, where mysteries unfold like petals. Where mysteries unfold like petals in moonlight, where stories drift through the darkness to carry you gently toward sleep. I am here with you now, as the world outside grows still, as the day releases its hold upon your thoughts. This is a place for rest, for the slow unwinding of the mind, where the strange and the wondrous walk hand in hand through gaslit streets and shadowed halls. Tonight, we journey to Victorian London, to the rooms at 221B Baker Street, where the great detective Sherlock Holmes confronts a mystery that stretches beyond the rational world he knows so well, into realms of ancient knowledge and forbidden texts. Let this story wash over you like warm water, like gentle rain upon a window pane. There is no need to follow every detail, no need to remember every name. Simply allow the words to carry you, to cradle you, as we slip together into this tale of Gothic wonder and soft-spoken intrigue. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain fell upon London like a whispered secret, each drop a tiny messenger tapping against the windows of Baker Street, creating that eternal percussion which has lulled so many to peaceful slumber. Inside the familiar rooms, where gaslight flickered against burgundy wallpaper, and the scent of pipe tobacco hung in the air like incense, Sherlock Holmes sat motionless in his leather armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his aquiline nose, his grey eyes fixed upon the dancing flames in the hearth. The fire crackled softly, each small collapse of burning wood sending spirals of sparks up the chimney, casting shadows that moved like living things across the Persian carpet and the cluttered surfaces laden with chemical apparatus, scattered newspapers, and the detritus of a brilliant mind perpetually engaged. Dr. John Watson occupied the chair opposite, a blanket draped across his legs, for the October evening had grown cold, and the rain had brought with it that penetrating chill which seems to seep through stone and mortar into the very bones of a city. He held a book loosely in his hands, though he had not turned a page in many minutes, content instead to listen to the symphony of the rain, the fire, the occasional horse-drawn carriage passing in the street below, its wheels creating soft splashes in the puddles that gathered upon the cobblestones. Mrs. Hudson had brought tea an hour before, the porcelain pot still warm beneath its quilted cosy, the cups painted with delicate blue flowers that seemed almost luminous in the firelight. It was nearly midnight when they heard the knock upon the door below, tentative at first, then more insistent, the kind of knock that speaks of desperation barely contained, of urgent need pressing against the boundaries of propriety. Holmes's eyes flickered, the only indication he had heard, while Watson set down his book and listened as Mrs. Hudson's footsteps moved along the lower hallway, as the front door opened with its familiar creak, as voices murmured in consultation, too quiet to discern their words. Then came the ascending footsteps upon the 17 stairs. Watson had counted them so many times, he knew their number as intimately as the lines upon his own palm. And Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway, her face troubled in the lamplight. "A visitor, Mr. Holmes," she said softly, her Scottish accent lending music to the words. "A Professor Aldrich Blackwood from the British Museum. He apologizes for the lateness of the hour, but he says the matter is of the gravest urgency and cannot wait until morning." Holmes unfolded himself from the chair with that peculiar grace he possessed, like a heron rising from still water. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, if you would be so kind. And perhaps a fresh pot of tea. I suspect our visitor has travelled through this rain, and will appreciate warmth." The fire shifted in the grate, a log settling with a soft sigh, as though the room itself prepared to receive the coming mystery. Professor Blackwood entered with the rain still glistening upon his coat, his grey hair dishevelled, his spectacles fogged from the transition from cold street to warm interior. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the stooped shoulders of one who has spent decades bent over ancient texts. And there was in his eyes a quality Watson recognized from his time in Afghanistan, the look of a man who has seen something that has shaken the foundations of his understanding, leaving him unmoored in suddenly uncertain waters. "Mr. Holmes," the professor began, his voice trembling slightly as Holmes guided him to the chair Watson had vacated, Watson himself moving to lean against the mantelpiece. "Dr. Watson, forgive this intrusion. I would not have come at such an hour, would not have come at all, were the circumstances not quite extraordinary." Holmes poured tea with surprising delicacy, his long fingers managing the pot and cup with practiced ease. The sound of liquid-filling porcelain seemed very loud in the quiet room, a domestic ritual that seemed to calm the professor somewhat. Steam rose from the cup in spiraling tendrils, carrying with it the scent of bergamot. "Take your time, Professor," Holmes said, settling into his own chair once more. "The rain will not cease for some hours yet, and the night is young. Watson and I are at your disposal." Blackwood wrapped his hands around the warm cup, and in the firelight, Watson could see they were trembling. "3 days ago," the professor began, his voice steadier now, "a manuscript arrived at the museum. It came by special courier, delivered in a sealed black case bearing no identification, no return address, only my name written upon a card in a hand I did not recognize. The courier himself could tell me nothing. He had been paid by a third party to deliver the case and vanished before I could question him further." The professor paused to drink, and Watson noticed how the tea seemed to restore him, the warmth spreading colour back into his pale cheeks. Outside, the rain intensified, its rhythm changing to a deeper thrumming against the windows. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the quarter hour, its sound muffled by the weather and the night. "The manuscript itself," Blackwood continued, setting down his cup with a slight rattle against the saucer, "is medieval in origin. I would estimate 13th century, though the materials suggest even greater antiquity. Vellum of the finest quality, illuminations that would rival anything in the royal collection, and text written in a mixture of Latin, Greek, and symbols I have never encountered in 40 years of paleographic study. But it is the content, Mr. Holmes, the content that has driven me to your door in the rain and the darkness." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes now fully engaged, reflecting the firelight like polished silver. "And what is this content, Professor? Before you fall asleep, write in the comments what time it is for you, and where you are from." Blackwood reached into his coat and withdrew a leather notebook, opening it to reveal careful transcriptions and sketches. The manuscript is titled Liber Diaboli Arcanum, the Book of Devil's Secrets. It purports to contain the collected knowledge of a medieval cult that believed they had discovered a method to bridge the material and spiritual worlds, to commune with entities that exist beyond the veil of death. The text describes rituals, incantations, and most disturbingly, claims to document successful attempts at these communications. The fire crackled, and a piece of coal shifted in the grate with a sound like footsteps in gravel. Watson found himself drawing his blanket more tightly around his shoulders, though whether from cold or the professor's words, he could not say. "But here is what troubles me most," Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, so that Watson had to lean closer to hear him over the rain. Within the manuscript are references to specific locations in London, buildings that exist today, drawn with such precision that I recognize them immediately. And there are dates, Mr. Holmes, dates in the future, dates that correspond to astronomical events, planetary alignments, lunar eclipses, configurations of stars. The next such date, according to the manuscript, is October 29th, 5 days from now. Holmes steepled his fingers once more, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and measured. And what is said to occur on this date? The manuscript speaks of a great opening, a moment when the barriers between worlds grow thin, when those who possess the knowledge might step through the veil and return again, bringing with them— The professor hesitated, as though the words themselves were difficult to speak, bringing with them proof of what lies beyond. In the street below, a carriage passed, its wheels creating soft splashing sounds that seemed to echo the professor's words, carrying them away into the rainy night. Watson watched as Holmes rose and moved to the window, his silhouette dark against the rain-streaked glass, his hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment there was no sound but the fire, the rain, the slow ticking of the clock upon the mantel. "You wish me to investigate the authenticity of this manuscript," Holmes said finally, his voice thoughtful, measured, "to determine whether it is genuine or an elaborate forgery." "More than that," Blackwood said, his voice urgent now. "I wish you to help me prevent whatever may occur on October 29th. For if this manuscript is genuine, if even a fraction of what it describes is possible, then 5 days hence something will attempt to cross from the other side. And Mr. Holmes, I do not think we are prepared for what that might mean." The fire settled once more in the grate, sending up a shower of sparks like tiny stars, and in that moment Watson felt the familiar thrill that always accompanied the beginning of their adventures, tempered now by something else, something he could not quite name, a sense of standing at the threshold of mysteries that reached beyond the comfortable rationalism of gaslight and science into older, darker territories of human experience and cosmic wonder, orchestrating seamless narrative continuation without repetition. Effa Holmes turned from the window, the rain still tracing delicate patterns down the glass behind him, and extended his hand toward the professor. "May I examine your transcriptions?" Blackwood passed the leather notebook across with visible reluctance, as though parting with it cost him something vital. Holmes settled himself beneath the lamp, adjusting the flame until it burned with clear, steady light, and began to study the pages with that intense concentration Watson had witnessed 1,000 times, his eyes moving rapidly across the professor's careful handwriting, his lips occasionally forming silent words as he absorbed the peculiar symbols and fragmentary translations. The clock on the mantelpiece measured the passing minutes with soft, rhythmic ticks, each one a small heartbeat in the quietness of the room. Watson poured more tea for Professor Blackwood, who accepted it gratefully, his hands no longer trembling quite so violently, the familiar routine of hospitality working its subtle magic against the anxiety that had driven him through London's rain-swept streets. The fire continued its ancient song, that primal sound which has comforted humanity since the first flames were tamed in prehistoric caves. And Watson found himself studying the play of light across the professor's careworn face, seeing in those deep lines the weight of knowledge accumulated over decades. And now this new burden, this manuscript that spoke of impossibilities. The symbols, Holmes murmured, more to himself than to his companions, follow a pattern consistent with Hermetic traditions, though corrupted, evolved. Here, he indicated a series of interlocking circles and geometric forms. This resembles the notation system used by John Dee, the Elizabethan mathematician and occultist, yet predates his work by some 3 centuries. Curious. He turned a page, his fingers gentle against the paper. And these astronomical calculations are remarkably precise. Whoever created this manuscript, genuine or forged, possessed sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, adding its voice to the rain's percussion, a low moaning sound that seemed to come from the very streets themselves, as though the city were breathing, sighing in its ancient sleep. Watson watched as Holmes continued his examination, occasionally making small notations in his own pocketbook, his brow furrowed in concentration, and in those moments Watson was reminded of how fortunate he was to witness this mind at work, to see genius applied to the unravelling of mystery, even mystery as strange and unsettling as this. "Professor," Holmes said finally, looking up from the notebook, "you mentioned specific locations in London. Which buildings does the manuscript reference?" Blackwood leaned forward, setting his teacup aside. 3 primary sites. The first is St. Dunstan's Church in Fleet Street, specifically the crypt beneath the chancel. The manuscript includes a detailed diagram of the crypt's layout, including a chamber that, according to official records, does not exist. The second location is an abandoned warehouse near the Thames docks in Wapping, marked in the manuscript with coordinates that correspond precisely to a building erected in 1857. How a medieval text could reference a Victorian warehouse is... He trailed off, shaking his head. And the third location, Holmes prompted gently. "The British Museum itself," Blackwood said, his voice dropping. "The manuscript describes a chamber beneath the reading room and provides measurements that align with the building's actual architecture. Mr. Holmes, I have worked in that museum for 37 years, and I have never heard mention of such a chamber." Holmes rose and moved to his desk, where maps of London lay rolled in a brass stand. He selected one and spread it across the desktop, securing its corners with books and his magnifying glass. His fingers traced the streets, finding the locations Blackwood had mentioned, and Watson moved to stand beside him, looking down at the familiar sprawl of their city, rendered in black ink and careful cartography. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making all 3 men glance toward the sound, and in that moment a piece of coal in the fireplace split with a sharp crack, sending sparks cascading against the fireguard. The sound seemed very loud in the startled silence, and Watson noticed how Blackwood flinched, his nerves clearly strained to their limits by the burden of knowledge he carried. "There is a geometry here," Holmes said, his finger moving from point to point upon the map. "These 3 locations form a triangle, nearly perfect in its proportions, and here, he indicated the centre of that triangle, lies Covent Garden, specifically the area around the old Templar church. Professor, does your manuscript make any reference to the Knights Templar? Blackwood's eyes widened. There are several passages that mention the warriors of the temple who carried secrets from Jerusalem. I had not made the connection to the physical location. Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes distant, seeing patterns and connections invisible to ordinary vision. The Templars were disbanded in the 14th century, their leaders executed, their order destroyed, but legends have persisted that they possessed esoteric knowledge acquired in the Holy Land, texts and artifacts that predated Christianity itself. If your manuscript is genuine, it may represent a fragment of that hidden knowledge. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, each drop a tiny clock marking time's passage. And Watson felt the night deepening around them, felt the weight of London's accumulated centuries pressing down upon these rooms where gaslight held back the darkness and reason struggled to encompass the inexplicable. He thought of all the cases they had investigated together, all the seemingly supernatural occurrences that had yielded to logic and evidence, revealed as human machinations, dressed in the garments of the mysterious. Yet something in the professor's face, in the careful precision of his transcriptions, suggested this case might venture into territories less easily mapped. Tomorrow, Holmes said, turning to face Blackwood, I should like to examine the manuscript itself. Can you arrange access? Of course, the professor replied. I have secured it in my private office. The museum directors know nothing of its contents. I thought it prudent to maintain discretion until I better understood what had fallen into my hands. Wise, Holmes agreed. For now, Professor, you should return home and rest. Watson will call a cab for you. He paused, his grey eyes thoughtful in the lamplight. But I must ask, have you experienced anything unusual since receiving the manuscript? Strange occurrences, unexplained phenomena, the sense of being observed? Blackwood hesitated, and in that hesitation, Watson saw the answer before the words came. The first night after I opened the case, I dreamed of a great hall filled with candlelight, and robed figures moving in procession. The same dream has returned each night since, always identical in every detail, and twice, walking home from the museum, I have felt. He struggled to articulate the sensation, as though someone walks beside me, just beyond the edge of vision. When I turn to look, there is no one there, only the echo of footsteps that might be my own or might be something else. The fire had burned low now, the coals glowing deep red like watchful eyes in the dimness, and Watson moved to add fresh wood, the action automatic, comforting in its familiarity. The new logs caught quickly, flames licking upward, banishing shadows back into the corners where they belonged, and the warmth spread outward in gentle waves, embracing the room and its occupants in renewed coziness. Holmes walked Blackwood to the door, speaking in low tones that Watson could not quite hear, words of reassurance and instruction, the detective's manner conveying that combination of confidence and empathy that had won the trust of so many troubled souls who sought his aid. Watson heard the professor's footsteps descending the stairs, heard the front door open and close, heard the sound of a cab drawing up, and then departing, carrying Blackwood back into the rainy night and whatever dreams awaited him. When Holmes returned, he stood for a moment by the fireplace, his hands extended toward the warmth, his profile sharp and thoughtful against the dancing light. "What do you make of it, Watson?" he asked quietly. Watson considered his words carefully, knowing Holmes valued honesty over comfort. The manuscript itself may be genuine in its age and materials, yet its contents could still be fabrication, medieval fantasy, or the delusions of a cult long extinct. But the professor's dreams, the sensation of being followed, those suggest either psychological distress brought on by exposure to disturbing material, or... He paused, uncomfortable with the alternative. Or we are dealing with something that operates beyond the comfortable boundaries of material causation, Holmes finished. Yes, that is precisely the question we must answer. Tomorrow we examine the manuscript, and then, I think, we must visit each of the 3 locations it describes, beginning with the church crypt. If there is indeed a hidden chamber beneath St. Dunstan's, its existence will tell us much about the reliability of our mysterious text. The clock struck 1, its chime soft and musical, marking the deep night hour when London sleeps most soundly, when even the restless find temporary peace. Holmes settled back into his chair, retrieving his pipe and beginning the ritual of filling it, the tobacco's sweet scent joining the wood smoke and rain freshness that filled the room. Watson resumed his own chair, the blanket once more across his legs, and picked up his abandoned book, though he suspected neither of them would read much this night. Instead, they sat in companionable silence, listening to the rain's eternal lullaby, watching the fire's slow dance. 2 friends in a warm room, while outside the great city dreamed its complex dreams, and somewhere within that vastness, a manuscript waited in darkness, holding secrets that might rewrite the boundaries between possible and impossible, between the world they knew and worlds that lay beyond all knowing, separated by veils thinner than faith, more fragile than the flame that held back the encroaching night. Morning arrived softly through the dissipating mist, pale sunlight filtering through Baker Street's windows, with that particular quality of light that follows heavy rain, as though the woe follows heavy rain, as though the world has been washed clean and rendered new. Watson woke in his own room to find Holmes already dressed and standing by the window, his breakfast untouched on the table, his attention fixed upon the street below, where puddles reflected patches of clearing sky and early pedestrians navigated the wet cobblestones with careful steps. The detective's face held that expression of intense focus Watson had learned to recognize, the outward calm that concealed furious mental activity, as though his mind were a great engine already running at full capacity while the rest of London still stirred from sleep. They took a cab through streets still glistening with yesterday's downpour, the horses' hooves creating rhythmic splashes that seemed to echo the rain's remembered percussion. The journey carried them past awakening shops, past newspaper boys calling headlines in voices that cut through the morning's quietness, past the slow unfurling of another London day, with all its ordinary miracles of commerce and conversation. Watson found himself studying the buildings they passed, wondering which of them might hold secrets, which facades might conceal chambers unmarked on any official plan, spaces where history accumulated in darkness like water seeping into forgotten wells. The British Museum rose before them with its imposing colonnade, that temple to human knowledge and curiosity, standing solid against the pale morning sky. They passed through its great doors into the hushed interior, where footsteps echoed against marble floors and voices dropped instinctively to respectful murmurs, as though the collected artifacts of millennia demanded reverence from those who walked among them. Professor Blackwood met them in the entrance hall, looking somewhat recovered from the previous night's agitation, though his eyes still held that haunted quality, that burden of knowledge pressing against his composure. "Gentlemen," he greeted them quietly, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. "Thank you for coming. I have arranged for us to use my private office, where we will not be disturbed. The manuscript awaits." They followed him through corridors lined with display cases containing fragments of ancient civilizations, pottery shards inscribed with forgotten languages, jewelry that had adorned the necks of Egyptian queens, coins bearing the profiles of Roman emperors. Watson felt the weight of accumulated time pressing around them, all these objects testimonies to human ambition and mortality, to the endless cycle of creation and decay that moved through history like tides through coastal waters. Somewhere a door closed softly, the sound travelling through the museum's vast spaces like a whisper carrying news from distant rooms. Blackwood's office proved to be a sanctuary of scholarship, walls lined floor to ceiling with books, their leather spines creating a mosaic of browns and burgundies, their gold lettering catching what light penetrated through the single tall window. A desk dominated the centre of the room, its surface covered with papers and open volumes, and upon it, within a glass case that seemed to absorb and hold the morning light, rested the manuscript. Holmes approached it slowly, his movements measured, reverent even, and Watson recognized this as the manner his friend adopted when confronting something that commanded genuine respect. The manuscript lay open to its first page, and even from a distance, Watson could see the extraordinary quality of its illumination. Gold leaf that seemed to glow with its own inner radiance, illustrations rendered in colours so vivid they might have been painted yesterday rather than centuries ago, intricate borders that drew the eye into labyrinthine patterns suggesting meanings just beyond comprehension. "Magnificent," Holmes breathed, bending to examine the page more closely, his hands carefully donning white cotton gloves that Blackwood provided. The pigments alone represent a fortune. Lapis lazuli for the blue, genuine vermilion, gold of remarkable purity, and the craftsmanship. He produced his magnifying glass, studying the minute details of the illuminations. Each human figure rendered with individual features, each plant species botanically accurate. This is the work of a master illuminator, someone who commanded resources and possessed skills of the highest order. Watson moved to stand beside Holmes, peering through the glass case at the medieval marvel. The text itself flowed in elegant script across vellum so fine it seemed almost translucent. Each letter formed with meticulous precision, and interspersed throughout were those strange symbols Blackwood had mentioned, geometric forms that seemed to shift and reconfigure as one looked at them, creating an almost hypnotic effect, as though they were designed to capture and hold the viewer's attention, to draw consciousness into their patterns. Professor Blackwood carefully lifted the glass case, allowing Holmes closer access. "You will notice," the professor said softly, "that the pages emit a very faint scent, something like sandalwood mixed with something else I cannot identify. It is most noticeable when the manuscript is first opened after being closed." Holmes leaned closer, breathing in carefully, his eyes closing in concentration. "Interesting. The sandalwood is clear enough, but there is indeed another element, something resinous, perhaps myrrh, and underneath that... He paused, his brow furrowing. Something organic that I cannot place. Watson, your medical training, does this scent suggest anything to you? Watson inhaled cautiously, trying to separate the components of the subtle fragrance that rose from the ancient pages. There is something almost pharmaceutical about it, beneath the incense notes, reminiscent of compounds used in preservation, perhaps, or, he hesitated, or substances used to induce altered states of consciousness. Medieval mystics sometimes employed herbal preparations to facilitate visions. A teacup rattled softly as Blackwood poured tea from a small service on a side table. The domestic sound seeming incongruous in the presence of this artifact that spoke of mysteries far removed from morning rituals and social comforts. Yet the professor's hands were steadier now, Watson noticed, as though having Holmes there to share the burden of the manuscript's implications had restored some measure of equilibrium. Holmes carefully turned pages, each movement deliberate, respectful of the vellum's fragility, despite its remarkable preservation. The illustrations grew more complex as he progressed, diagrams of celestial configurations, architectural floor plans rendered with draftsman-like precision, and most strikingly, a series of images depicting robed figures arranged in circular formations within spaces that resembled underground chambers. The figures' faces were turned upward, their hands raised in gestures that might have been supplication or command, and above them, rendered in colours that seemed to shimmer in the morning light, floated shapes that defied easy description, forms that were neither entirely geometric nor organic, that seemed to exist in a space between categories, suggesting dimensions the medieval artist had struggled to represent on two-dimensional parchment. Here, Holmes said, indicating one of the architectural diagrams with a gloved finger, is the plan of St. Dunstan's crypt that Professor Blackwood mentioned. You see how it shows dimensions that extend beyond the recorded structure, and these measurements, he withdrew a small ruler from his pocket, are given in units that predate the standardization of English measurement, yet they convert precisely to modern feet and inches with mathematical exactitude. Someone has encoded extremely specific information within this medieval framework. Watson studied the diagram, trying to reconcile the impossibility of what they were examining. How could a medieval manuscript contain plans for a Victorian warehouse? How could it reference astronomical events with precision that suggested modern calculation? Yet here it lay before them, undeniably real, its pages radiating that faint, complex scent, its illuminations glowing with colours that seemed somehow alive in the morning light filtering through Blackwood's window. Holmes spent the better part of an hour examining the manuscript page by page, occasionally making notes in his pocketbook, sometimes requesting Blackwood's translation of particular Latin phrases or interpretation of obscure symbols. Watson found himself mesmerized by the rhythm of this investigation, by the soft sound of turning pages, by Holmes's occasional murmured observations, by the way sunlight moved gradually across the office floor as the morning advanced, marking time's passage with a sundial's ancient certainty. Finally, Holmes straightened, removing the gloves and setting them aside. "Professor, I must ask, have you permitted anyone else to examine this manuscript since its arrival?" "No one," Blackwood replied firmly. "You are the first persons beside myself to view it. And the courier who delivered it, you said he was paid by a third party. Did he provide any description of this intermediary?" only that he received the package and his instructions from a solicitor's office in Gray's Inn. I have the address, though when I sent an inquiry there, I received no response. Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes distant. That look, Watson knew, meant his mind was sorting through possibilities, constructing and discarding theories with the speed and precision of a master chess player analysing a complex board. Outside the window, a bell began to toll the hour, its sound muffled by the museum's thick walls, and somewhere in the building's depths, a door opened and closed, footsteps echoing briefly in distant corridors, before fading into the perpetual silence that accumulated around ancient things. "We must visit St. Dunstan's this afternoon," Holmes announced. "If the manuscript's architectural details prove accurate for one location, it will significantly strengthen the case for its reliability regarding the others. Professor, can you spare the day to accompany us? Your expertise may prove invaluable." Blackwood's face showed both eagerness and apprehension. "Of course. Though I confess, Mr. Holmes, part of me hopes we find nothing beneath that church but empty space and medieval stonework. The alternative, that this manuscript represents genuine knowledge of forces beyond our understanding, is deeply unsettling." "Truth often is," Holmes replied gently, "but we serve truth regardless of its comfort, do we not? That is the burden and privilege of those who seek knowledge rather than mere reassurance." Watson moved to the window while the other men discussed arrangements, looking out over the museum's grounds where early visitors strolled along paths still damp from yesterday's rain. He thought about the manuscript lying on Blackwood's desk, about the impossibilities it represented, about the steady accumulation of evidence pointing toward conclusions that violated everything his medical training and scientific worldview had taught him about reality's fixed boundaries. Yet here was Holmes, the most rational man Watson knew, taking these impossibilities seriously, approaching them with the same methodical rigor he applied to more conventional mysteries. Perhaps, Watson reflected, true rationality meant following evidence wherever it led, even into territories where reason itself seemed to lose its familiar footing, where the maps ran out and one sailed by stranger stars than any charted in conventional astronomy. The morning continued its gentle progression toward afternoon, and in that office, surrounded by books and ancient learning, 3 men prepared to descend into darkness beneath an old church, seeking chambers that might or might not exist, following clues left by hands that had returned to dust centuries before, guided by a manuscript that whispered of worlds beyond the world, of knowledge that predated history's written record, of mysteries that waited patient as stone for those brave or foolish enough to seek their revelation. The afternoon found them standing before St. Dunstan's Church, for St. Dunstan's Church in Fleet Street, its ancient stonework darkened by centuries of London soot and weather, its Gothic spire reaching toward grey clouds that promised more rain before nightfall. The church sat nestled among the press of newer buildings, like a survivor from an earlier age, a remnant of medieval London that had witnessed plague and fire, Reformation and Revolution, yet continued to mark the hours with its clock that had measured time since the 17th century. Traffic moved past in both directions, omnibuses and hansom cabs, pedestrians hurrying about their business, yet the church itself seemed to exist in a pocket of stillness, as though the accumulated prayers of centuries had created around it an atmosphere of contemplation that the modern world's bustle could not entirely penetrate. Holmes paused on the pavement, his keen eyes studying the building's exterior with that systematic attention he brought to every investigation, noting the architectural details, the worn steps leading to the main entrance, the small door set into the northern wall that likely led to the vestry. Professor Blackwood stood beside him, clutching a leather case that contained his transcriptions of the manuscript's floor plans, while Watson brought up the rear, his medical bag in hand, a precaution Holmes had suggested, for who knew what conditions they might encounter in chambers sealed for unknown years. The vicar who answered their knock proved to be a pleasant man in his 50s, Reverend Thomas Ainsworth, whose initial wariness at unexpected visitors transformed to curiosity when Holmes presented his card and explained, with careful vagueness, that they were investigating historical claims about the church's structure. Ainsworth led them through the main sanctuary, where afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, painting the wooden pews in pools of coloured radiance, ruby red and sapphire blue, emerald green and amber gold, each colour seeming to hold its own particular quality of luminescence, as though light passing through centuries-old glass acquired properties different from ordinary illumination. Their footsteps echoed against stone floors as they descended toward the crypt, the stairs narrow and worn smooth by generations of feet, spiralling downward into increasing dimness where the daylight could not follow. Ainsworth carried a lantern that cast dancing shadows against the walls, and Watson found himself acutely aware of descending, of moving from the world of surface and sunlight into older depths where air hung cool and still, scented with that peculiar combination of damp stone and ancient mortar that characterizes spaces long removed from weather's direct touch. The crypt opened before them, a vaulted chamber supported by pillars whose capitals bore carved faces, worn nearly smooth by time's patient erosion. Here rested the stone coffins of the church's medieval benefactors, their effigies lying atop the sarcophagi in attitudes of eternal prayer, hands clasped, eyes closed, their stone features peaceful in the lantern's flickering light. The silence felt profound, weighted, as though the dead themselves listened to these living visitors who disturbed their long repose. The crypt has not been used for interments since the 18th century, Ainsworth explained, his voice hushed by instinct in this place of rest. We maintain it primarily for historical interest, though few visitors request access. Most prefer the church proper, with its famous clock and literary associations. Holmes moved among the pillars, his eyes scanning walls and floor, occasionally tapping stones with his walking stick, listening to the sound each impact produced. Watson watched this systematic examination, understanding that Holmes sought some irregularity, some indication of spaces beyond what official architecture acknowledged. Professor Blackwood had withdrawn his transcriptions and stood studying them by lantern light, comparing the manuscript's diagrams to the visible structure around them. A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the crypt, perhaps a rat disturbed by their intrusion, perhaps merely settling stone, and all four men paused, listening. The silence that followed seemed somehow more profound than what had preceded it, as though the crypt itself held its breath, waiting. Then Ainsworth chuckled softly, embarrassed. These old places play tricks on the imagination. Every creak and whisper becomes a ghost when one stands among so many dead. Quite so, Holmes agreed, though Watson noticed his friend's attention had sharpened at the sound, his head tilted in an attitude of acute listening. Reverend, Your records indicate the crypt's dimensions. Have there been any structural surveys conducted in recent years? Not to my knowledge, Ainsworth replied. The church vestry holds plans dating back to various renovations, but I cannot say how comprehensive they might be. Why do you ask? Holmes had moved to the eastern wall, running his hands across the stone, his fingers finding the gaps between blocks. Architectural curiosity, primarily. Medieval builders sometimes incorporated spaces not immediately obvious. Storage chambers, passages connecting to other buildings, that sort of thing. Your crypt, for instance, seems remarkably small given the church's overall footprint. Blackwood approached, holding his lantern high, and Watson saw understanding pass between him and Holmes. The professor's diagram showed the crypt extending perhaps 20 feet further eastward than the chamber in which they stood, and where that extension should exist, there was only solid wall, or so it appeared. Holmes withdrew a small knife and began to carefully probe the mortar between stones, working his way along a particular section of wall. The scraping sound seemed very loud in the enclosed space, each stroke of the blade against ancient cement, creating a small shower of dust and granules that drifted down like snow, falling in extreme slow motion. Watson found himself holding his breath, watching as Holmes worked with that methodical patience he brought to all physical investigations, never hurrying, never forcing, simply proceeding with systematic thoroughness. Here, Holmes said quietly, his knife blade having sunk deeper than expected into what had appeared to be solid mortar. He withdrew the blade and inserted it again, a foot to the left, finding similar give. Reverend Ainsworth, how well sealed is this crypt? Does moisture seep in during heavy rains? The crypt remains remarkably dry, Ainsworth replied, which has always struck us as fortunate, given London's water table. Some of our neighbouring churches suffer terrible problems with damp. Yet this section of wall, Holmes continued, now working the knife blade in a vertical line, shows evidence of relatively recent remortaring. You can see where the colour and texture differ slightly from the surrounding original work. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to make this appear seamless, but under close examination, the disguise becomes apparent. Watson stepped closer, raising his own small lantern to better illuminate the area Holmes indicated. Now that it had been pointed out, he could indeed see the subtle difference, a slightly lighter shade to certain sections of mortar, a texture that did not quite match the weathered appearance of the surrounding joints. It was masterfully done, would fool any casual observer, yet revealed itself to focused scrutiny as surely as invisible ink appears when treated with the proper reagent. A draught of cold air suddenly moved through the crypt, causing the lantern flames to gutter and dance. And with it came a scent Watson could not identify, something faintly acrid, like burnt herbs or incense, utterly foreign to the damp stone smell that otherwise dominated this underground space. The draught passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the flames burning steady once more. But its passage seemed to have subtly altered the atmosphere, as though it had carried with it some intangible quality from elsewhere, some breath from spaces where air circulated through different channels, touched by different substances than any found in conventional London cellars. Professor Blackwood's face had gone pale. "That scent," he whispered, "the same as the manuscript." Holmes straightened, his eyes bright with the thrill of discovery. "Reverend Ainsworth, I must ask your permission to conduct a more thorough investigation of this wall. I have reason to believe there may be a sealed chamber beyond, one that predates modern church records. Whatever lies there may have significant historical value. Ainsworth looked uncertain, torn between curiosity and caution. I would need to consult with the church wardens before authorizing any structural alterations. The building is protected, you understand, and any damage— I propose no damage, Holmes assured him smoothly. Merely the removal of mortar from this section here. He indicated an area perhaps 3 feet wide, to determine what lies behind. If we find solid stone, we replace the mortar, and you have lost nothing but an afternoon. If we find space beyond, well, then you have discovered a hitherto unknown aspect of your church's history. Either outcome serves the cause of knowledge. The vicar considered this, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the small cross he wore on a chain around his neck. Watson recognized the gesture, a seeking of reassurance, of permission from higher authority than any human could provide. Finally, Ainsworth nodded. Very well, but I insist on remaining present during any such investigation. These dead are in my care, and I will not leave them unguarded while strangers probe the very walls that shelter their rest. Most proper, Holmes agreed. Watson, I shall need some tools from the cab. Perhaps you might retrieve them while the professor and I make more detailed measurements. Watson climbed the spiral stairs back toward daylight, grateful for the excuse to breathe fresh air after the crypt's close atmosphere. The sanctuary seemed almost startlingly bright after the dimness below, and he paused a moment, letting his eyes adjust, listening to the ordinary sounds of Fleet Street filtering through the old walls, cartwheels on cobblestones, vendors calling their wares, the endless human symphony of London going about its business, utterly unaware that beneath one of its ancient churches, seekers probed toward mysteries that might rewrite the comfortable boundaries between known and unknown, between the world of surfaces and whatever depths might lie beneath. He retrieved Holmes's toolcase from the cab. The driver had agreed to wait, settling himself for a long afternoon with a newspaper and a pipe, and descended once more into the crypt's cool embrace. Holmes and Blackwood had set up additional lanterns borrowed from the vestry, creating a pool of light around the wall section under investigation, and Holmes had marked with chalk the precise area he intended to examine. The white lines stood out starkly against the dark stone, a modern geometric intrusion into medieval organic forms. The work proceeded slowly, carefully, Holmes using various tools to chip away the suspicious mortar, Blackwood holding lanterns to illuminate the work, Watson standing ready with his medical bag should anyone suffer injury from flying stone chips, and Ainsworth watching with an expression caught between fascination and growing unease. The sounds of their labour, the tap of chisel against stone, the scrape of blade against mortar, the soft breathing of men engaged in concentrated physical effort, created a strange counterpoint to the crypt's essential silence, as though they were musicians playing a composition written for tools and stone rather than instruments and air. After perhaps 20 minutes of work, Holmes's chisel suddenly sank inward with a hollow sound that made all of them freeze. Watson felt his heartbeat quicken, saw Blackwood's hands tighten on the lantern he held. Holmes carefully withdrew the chisel and leaned close to the gap he had created, no more than an inch wide. A breath of that same strange scent emerged from the opening, stronger now, unmistakable. sandalwood and myrrh, and something else. Something that made Watson's medical instincts prickle with warning, though he could not have said precisely why. "There is indeed a space beyond," Holmes announced quietly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of excitement he rarely allowed to surface. "And it is not empty. I can see stonework of a different character, and what appears to be. But no, I must see more clearly before making any definite statements." The opening grew, became a gap large enough for a man to peer through, and Holmes positioned lanterns on either side before looking within. The silence stretched as he examined whatever lay beyond, and Watson watched his friend's profile in the lantern light, seeing the intensity of concentration, the slight widening of eyes that suggested genuine surprise. Finally, Holmes withdrew and turned to face them. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "the manuscript was entirely accurate. There is a chamber beyond this wall, and it is not natural formation. Someone built this space deliberately, furnished it with care, and sealed it so thoroughly that no hint of its existence survived in official records. I propose we enlarge this opening sufficient to permit entry, so that we might properly examine what has lain hidden here beneath a London church, while the world above went about its business, ignorant of the secrets that rested beneath its very feet. The chamber that revealed itself to them existed in a state of preservation, so complete it seemed to mock the passage of time, as though sealed air and darkness had conspired to hold these objects in suspension, untouched by the centuries that had transformed the London above from medieval town to sprawling metropolis. Holmes led the way through the enlarged opening, moving carefully across the threshold, with a lantern held high, and Watson followed close behind, his medical training making him instinctive about testing the floor before committing his full weight, ensuring the stones beneath remained stable after their long isolation from human footfall. The chamber stretched perhaps 30 feet in length and 20 in width, its ceiling supported by a single central pillar, carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the lantern light. Serpentine forms intertwined with geometric patterns, stars enclosed in circles, hands reaching upward toward crescents and suns, rendered in stone that had once been painted, traces of gold leaf still clinging to recessed carvings. The walls bore frescoes, faded, but still discernible, depicting scenes that Watson struggled to interpret. Robed figures arranged in circular formations, their faces turned toward central points, where shapes floated that defied his ability to categorize them as either artistic abstraction or attempted representation of something the medieval painter had actually witnessed. Professor Blackwood entered last, his breathing audible in the chamber's profound silence, and Watson heard the sharp intake of breath as the historian's eyes adjusted to the lantern light and began to comprehend what surrounded them. Reverend Ainsworth remained at the opening, unwilling to enter, but equally unable to look away, his face pale in the indirect illumination, his hands gripping the rough stone edges of the breach they had created. A small sound drew Watson's attention downward, a piece of mortar from the opening falling to the chamber floor, bouncing once before settling into stillness. The sound seemed disproportionately loud, as though the chamber's acoustics amplified every noise, and in its wake the silence felt somehow denser, more present, as if the space itself had awakened to their intrusion, and now listened with attention born of long dormancy. Holmes moved to the central pillar, examining the carved symbols with his magnifying glass. occasionally making notations in his pocketbook. "The iconography here predates Christianity," he observed, his voice thoughtful, measured. "These are symbols associated with earlier mystery traditions, Egyptian, Greek, perhaps even older sources. Yet they coexist with Latin inscriptions that reference saints and biblical passages. Someone was attempting to synthesize, to find common ground between pagan wisdom and Christian theology." Watson approached the niche containing the book, drawn by the historian's instinct to examine texts, to seek knowledge in written words rather than enigmatic symbols. The leather binding bore tooled patterns that formed, when viewed as a whole, a great circular design with the book's spine as its center, radiating outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. He could see writing on the spine, letters formed in a script that seemed familiar yet strange, as though he were looking at English words through distorting glass. "May I?" he asked, looking to Holmes, who nodded permission. Watson carefully lifted the book from its niche, surprised by its weight. The covers were thick, and something more than paper lay between them. He set it gently upon a stone ledge that ran along the southern wall, perhaps once used as a working surface or altar, and opened the cover with the delicacy one might use handling butterfly wings. The first page bore an illumination similar in style to the manuscript in Blackwood's office, the same quality of craftsmanship, the same pigments creating colours that seemed impossibly fresh given their age. But where the museum manuscript bore elaborate decorative borders, this book's first page contained a single image, a doorway rendered in such precise perspective it created the illusion of depth, as though one might step through the page into whatever space that door accessed. Blackwood had approached and now stood beside Watson, his breath coming in short gasps. "This is a grimoire," the professor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A ritual book containing the accumulated knowledge of the group that used this chamber. Look," he indicated the text that began on the second page. "It's written in the same mixture of languages as the museum manuscript. Latin, Greek, and these symbols that I still cannot fully translate." Holmes joined them, his eyes scanning the open pages with that intensity that suggested his mind was processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. "This volume and the manuscript Professor Blackwood received are connected works," he stated, "likely part of a larger collection, a library of occult knowledge maintained by this medieval cult. The question becomes, who sent the manuscript to the museum, and why now, after centuries of concealment?" A draught moved through the chamber, though from what source Watson could not determine. The opening they had created in the wall was behind them, and he could see no other obvious gaps in the stonework. Yet the air moved nonetheless, carrying with it that now familiar scent of sandalwood and myrrh, and that other element, that organic undertone that Watson's medical instincts found increasingly troubling. The lantern flames bent and flickered, casting wild shadows across the frescoed walls, making the painted figures seem to shift and gesture in the unstable light. Holmes had moved to explore the chamber's far end, where Watson now noticed the floor changed character. Where they stood, stones lay fitted in a regular pattern, but toward the chamber's eastern extremity, the floor consisted of a single great circular slab of different stone, darker, shot through with veins of quartz that caught the light and reflected it in sparkling points, like stars in a miniature heaven. At the circle's center lay another symbol, this one carved deep into the stone, and once filled with some substance that had darkened to black over the passing years. A design that combined elements Watson recognized from Hermetic traditions, with forms that seemed entirely novel, as though whoever created it had received instruction from sources not recorded in conventional grimoires. "Gentlemen," Holmes called softly, "I believe we have found the ritual space the manuscript describes. This circle," he indicated the darker stone, "would have served as the focus for whatever ceremonies took place here. The participants would have stood around its circumference, using the implements from those niches, following the instructions contained in books like the one Watson has discovered." Reverend Ainsworth's voice came from the opening, strained and uncertain. "Mr. Holmes, I must insist we reseal this chamber. What you describe, rituals conducted in secret beneath a Christian church, this is unholy ground. These artifacts should not be disturbed." "With respect, Reverend," Holmes replied, his tone gentle but firm, "knowledge itself is neither holy nor unholy. It is what humans do with knowledge that acquires moral character. And we cannot make informed decisions about what should be done with this chamber until we understand what it contains and what purposes it served. Surely you agree that ignorance serves no one's interests." The vicar did not respond, but neither did he leave, and Watson understood the man's conflict. His duty to protect his church warring with his human curiosity, his theological certainty confronted by physical evidence of beliefs that preceded and perhaps challenged his own tradition. It was a position Watson found himself sympathizing with, for his own worldview felt increasingly strained by what they were discovering, by the accumulating evidence that suggested human history contained chapters not recorded in official accounts, that beneath the surface of conventional understanding ran deeper currents of knowledge and practice that the modern age had forgotten or deliberately suppressed. Blackwood had begun examining the other niches, cataloguing their contents with a historian's systematic attention. Here we have what appears to be a ceremonial robe, remarkably well preserved. And this, he lifted a small glass vial, still sealed with wax, likely contains some substance used in the rituals, oils or tinctures, perhaps hallucinogenic preparations. Medieval mysticism often employed such aids to induce altered states of consciousness. Holmes returned to the central pillar, running his hands across its carved surface with a touch so light his fingers barely made contact. "The question that troubles me," he said, speaking as much to himself as to his companions, "is one of timing. This chamber has remained sealed for centuries. The mortar work we removed, while cleverly disguised, was at least 200 years old, possibly older. Yet 3 days ago, a manuscript arrives at the British Museum providing precise details of this chamber's location and contents. Someone wanted this space discovered. Someone went to considerable effort to ensure Professor Blackwood received that manuscript. Why? What purpose does it serve to reveal secrets so carefully hidden?" A sound echoed through the chamber, a low, resonant tone like a bell struck in the far distance, its vibrations seeming to travel through the stone itself rather than the air. All 4 men froze, listening. The sound came again, slightly louder, and Watson realized with a start that it was the church bell above them, marking the hour. Yet here, filtered through layers of stone and earth, transformed by the chamber's peculiar acoustics, it acquired an almost otherworldly quality, as though the bell rang, not just in the tower above, but in some parallel space that overlapped this one, its sound travelling through dimensions rather than merely through physical distance. The bell's reverberations faded slowly, leaving in their wake a silence that felt somehow charged, expectant. Watson found his heart beating faster, his senses heightened in a way that reminded him of his time in Afghanistan. That state of alert awareness when danger might arrive from any quarter. Yet no threat presented itself. Only this stone chamber with its mysterious artifacts, its enigmatic symbols, its atmosphere of accumulated purpose and concealed knowledge. Holmes had withdrawn the manuscript diagrams from his pocket and was comparing them to the chamber's actual layout. The manuscript shows not just this space, he said, unfolding the papers, but suggests this is merely one of 3 connected sites, the warehouse in Wapping and the chamber beneath the British Museum. If those locations prove equally accurate, we are dealing with a network, a system designed to accomplish something requiring multiple focal points distributed across London. A system for what purpose? Watson asked, though he suspected he knew the answer, had known it perhaps since first seeing the manuscript's illuminations in Blackwood's office, had felt it in the peculiar atmosphere of this chamber, in the careful arrangement of artifacts that spoke of rituals practiced with serious intent by people who believed absolutely in what they were attempting. For opening doorways, Professor Blackwood answered quietly, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant conclusion. For creating passages between this world and others. That is what the manuscript describes, what these symbols represent, what this circular stone was designed to facilitate. They believed, these medieval practitioners, these careful recorders of forbidden knowledge, they believed they had discovered methods to pierce the veil between dimensions, to contact, and perhaps even traverse into realms that exist parallel to our own, separated by barriers thinner than we imagine, more penetrable than orthodoxy admits. The lantern light seemed to dim for a moment, though perhaps it was only Watson's imagination, and in that brief dimness the carved figures on the pillar appeared to move, to shift their stone positions ever so slightly. Then the light stabilized, and the forms were merely stone again, frozen in their eternal gestures, pointing toward heights or depths beyond the chamber's confines. Holmes carefully folded the diagrams and returned them to his pocket. Tomorrow we visit the warehouse in Wapping, then the British Museum. If all 3 locations confirm the manuscript's accuracy, we will know with certainty that we are dealing with something more than medieval fantasy or elaborate forgery. We will know that someone, whether the original cult or some modern descendant of their tradition, has maintained this knowledge through centuries and has now chosen to reveal it for reasons we do not yet understand. He turned to face them all, his expression serious in the uncertain light. And we will have to decide what we do with that knowledge, whether we attempt to prevent whatever is planned for October 29th, or whether we observe and document what occurs. For I confess, gentlemen, my curiosity is aroused. If there is even the slightest possibility that these rituals achieve what they claim, that doorways can indeed be opened, that communication with other dimensions is possible, then we stand on the threshold of discoveries that would transform human understanding of reality itself. The chamber seemed to listen to these words, seemed to hold them in its stone embrace, and Watson wondered how many similar conversations had taken place here in centuries past. How many seekers had stood in this same space, debating the same questions about knowledge and wisdom, about curiosity and caution, about the eternal human desire to push beyond known boundaries into territories where maps offered no guidance and conventional wisdom provided no compass. The questions themselves seemed as old as thought, as persistent as the human spirit that forever seeks to transcend its limitations, to touch mysteries that shimmer just beyond the reach of ordinary consciousness, promising revelation or destruction, or perhaps both together, inseparable as light from shadow, as discovery from danger, as wonder from the terror that wonder sometimes brings in its wake. Evening found them in a hansom cab, rattling eastward through London's arterial streets, the day's discoveries settling into their minds like sediment drifting through water, seeking its natural level. Holmes sat in characteristic silence, his long frame folded into the cramped space, his eyes fixed upon the passing cityscape without appearing to truly see it. That inward-turning gaze Watson recognized as the visible sign of intense mental activity, his friend's extraordinary mind sorting and cataloguing, building theories and testing them against evidence, discarding what did not fit and refining what remained. Professor Blackwood occupied the opposite seat, the leather case containing his transcriptions resting across his knees like a shield, his fingers occasionally touching it as though to reassure himself of its solid presence. They had left Reverend Ainsworth with instructions to seal the opening they had created, to permit no one else access to the hidden chamber until they better understood what forces might have been set in motion by its discovery. The vicar had agreed with visible relief, eager to restore at least the appearance of normalcy to his church, though Watson suspected the man would find little peace in knowing what lay beneath his sanctuary, what artifacts of older faiths rested in darkness while he conducted Sunday services in the light above. The city transformed around them as they travelled eastward, the character of neighbourhoods shifting like chapters in a book, whose subject gradually darkens. The comfortable respectability of Fleet Street gave way to the commercial bustle of the city proper, then further east to regions where prosperity thinned, and struggle showed more plainly in the faces of those who moved through streets growing narrower, buildings leaning closer together as though seeking mutual support against the weight of poverty and hard circumstance. Gas lamps appeared less frequently, their pools of illumination separated by stretches of shadow, where anything might hide or simply exist, unnoticed by those who hurried past, with eyes fixed on destinations, rather than the spaces between. Wapping emerged from the gathering dusk, like something conjured from London's maritime memory, that liminal zone where the city met the Thames, and commerce flowed in tidal rhythms, measured by ships arriving from distant ports, by goods transferred from hold to warehouse, by the eternal dance of trade that had made London wealthy and powerful, and eternally hungry for more. The air here tasted different. Salt and river water, tar and rope, spices whose names Watson could not identify bleeding from warehouses, where they awaited distribution to markets across England. The Thames itself lay somewhere beyond the buildings. Its presence felt more than seen, that great dark artery carrying the city's commercial blood towards the sea. Their cab slowed as Holmes consulted the address derived from the manuscript's coordinates, and presently they stopped before a warehouse that loomed against the darkening sky, its brick facade water-stained and weathered, its windows, those not broken, filmed with grime that rendered them opaque as cataracts. A sign still hung above the main entrance, though the painted letters had faded beyond legibility. and the doors themselves stood slightly ajar, one hanging askew on hinges that had rusted beyond their capacity to properly support its weight. Watson paid the driver, who accepted the fare with a look that suggested he thought them mad to visit such a place as night approached, and departed with unseemly haste, his horse's hooves creating a rapid percussion against cobblestones slick with recent rain and whatever substances leaked perpetually from warehouses and drained toward the river. The sound faded quickly, leaving them standing before the derelict building, in a silence broken only by distant ship horns calling through the fog that had begun to rise from the Thames, that eternal London fog which transforms familiar streets into mazes where even natives can lose their way. Holmes produced a dark lantern from his coat, lighting it with practiced efficiency, and pushed the damaged door wider, its protest a long-drawn groan of metal and wood that seemed to announce their presence to whatever watched from within. They entered single file, Holmes leading with the lantern held high, Watson following with his walking stick at the ready, Blackwood bringing up the rear, his breathing audible in the enclosed space, quick and shallow with nervousness poorly concealed. The warehouse interior stretched before them in darkness, so complete the lantern's beam seemed to struggle against it, creating a cone of visibility that revealed stacked crates and barrels abandoned years ago, their contents long since removed or rotted to nothing. The floor lay thick with dust that recorded their passage in clear footprints, and Watson noted with interest that theirs were not the first. Other marks showed where someone had walked here recently, within days if he judged correctly, paths through the dust suggesting purposeful movement toward the warehouse's rear, rather than the random exploration of vagrant or curious youth. A sound echoed from somewhere in the building's depths, perhaps a rat disturbed by their intrusion, perhaps loose timber settling under its own weight, perhaps something else entirely. Holmes paused, his head tilted in that attitude of intense listening, his free hand raised to signal silence. They waited, frozen in a tableau that would have seemed absurd in daylight, but felt entirely appropriate in this darkness. This space that smelled of decay and river damp, and underneath those familiar odours, that same scent they had encountered in the church crypt, sandalwood, myrrh, and that organic undertone Watson's medical training still could not identify, but which triggered instinctive wariness, some deep recognition that what he smelled was not entirely benign. The sound did not repeat, and after a long moment, Holmes lowered his hand and continued forward, following the paths marked in the dust. They passed between towering stacks of crates whose origins Watson could only guess at. Imports from India, perhaps, or China. Goods that had travelled halfway around the world to rest forgotten in this London warehouse, waiting for owners who would never return, or had forgotten what they had stored here in the first place. Somewhere water dripped with metronomic regularity, marking time in a space where time had otherwise ceased to matter, where past and present blurred together in perpetual gloom. The manuscript's diagram had indicated stairs descending to a lower level, and Holmes found them at the warehouse's eastern end, a narrow wooden staircase dropping into darkness so profound it seemed almost solid, a darkness that had accumulated over years of disuse until it acquired substance and weight. Holmes paused at the top of these stairs, withdrawing the manuscript diagrams once more to verify the location. And Watson saw in his friend's face that mixture of excitement and caution that marked moments when investigation approached its critical juncture, when theory would be confirmed or refuted by physical evidence. "The diagram shows a cellar," Holmes said quietly, his voice seeming too loud in the warehouse's hush, "extending beneath the building's footprint, with a chamber at its far end, constructed of different materials than the surrounding foundation. Stone rather than brick, suggesting much greater age. If the pattern holds..." A crash from above cut short his explanation, the sound of something heavy falling or being pushed, followed by footsteps moving across the upper floor, purposeful, unhurried, approaching the area where they stood. Watson's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, where he kept the service revolver he had carried since Afghanistan, his military training asserting itself in the face of potential threat. Holmes extinguished the lantern with a quick motion, plunging them into absolute darkness. And Watson felt, rather than saw his friend move closer, heard the whisper of instruction carried on breath alone. "Down the stairs, quickly but quietly. We must reach the chamber before whoever searches above decides to investigate below." They descended in darkness so complete, Watson had to feel his way step by step, his hand on the rough wooden railing, his feet testing each tread before committing weight. Aware of Blackwood behind him breathing heavily, the professor's terror barely contained, but his determination holding firm. The stairs seemed to descend far deeper than the building's single story would suggest, and Watson began to wonder if they connected to something older, some structure that predated the warehouse itself, cellars that had served earlier buildings on this same ground. Layers of London's history stacked like geological strata, each era building upon the ruins of what came before. They reached the bottom at last, and Holmes risked relighting the lantern, keeping its beam directed downward, shielded by his coat. The cellar floor was earthen, packed hard by age and dampness, and unlike the warehouse above, this space showed no evidence of a recent visitation. The dust here lay undisturbed save by their own footprints, and cobwebs stretched thick across passages, leading deeper into the foundations. Yet that scent persisted, stronger here, suggesting the source lay ahead in the chamber the manuscript described. Holmes moved forward with the confidence of one following a map memorized in detail. And indeed, Watson realized his friend must have committed the diagrams to memory, for he navigated through the cellar's maze of supporting pillars and stored debris without hesitation, leading them unerringly toward the eastern extremity, where stone walls replaced brick, where the architecture changed character, became older, constructed according to principles that predated modern building codes and Victorian engineering. The chamber revealed itself gradually as the lantern light pushed back shadows that seemed reluctant to yield their territory. Like the space beneath St. Dunstan's, this room had been constructed with obvious purpose, its walls smooth stone blocks fitted with precision that spoke of skilled masons working to exacting specifications. But where the church chamber had felt almost welcoming in its preservation of artifacts and carefully arranged niches, this space carried an atmosphere of profound unease, as though whatever had transpired here had left a residue that clung to the stones themselves, that affected the very air in ways Watson's rational mind struggled to accept, yet his instincts could not deny. The floor here bore the same circular design they had found in the church crypt. Darker stone set into the surrounding material, veined with quartz that caught the lantern light and reflected it in cold, distant sparkles. But this circle was larger, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, and the symbols carved into its surface were more elaborate, more complex, suggesting this location served as a more significant node in whatever system the manuscript described. At the circle's cardinal points stood stone pillars, each carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the uncertain light. And between these pillars stretched nothing, just empty air where Watson would have expected chains or ropes or some physical connection. Yet the sense of something linking these pillars persisted, an intuition of connections existing beyond visible spectrum, felt rather than seen. Professor Blackwood approached the nearest pillar, his hand extended, but not quite touching the stone, as though he feared contact might trigger something best left dormant. "This arrangement," he said, his voice trembling, "corresponds exactly to descriptions in the manuscript. These pillars would serve as anchoring points, locations where practitioners would stand during rituals, using their combined will and whatever substances they ingested to create what the text calls sympathetic resonance across the three sites." Holmes had moved to the chamber's centre, standing within the great circle, turning slowly to examine the space from all angles. 3 points forming a triangle across London, he said thoughtfully. Each location prepared with similar symbols, similar arrangements. The manuscript describes them as lenses, focusing points through which energy, or consciousness, or whatever theoretical framework one wishes to apply, might be directed and amplified. Taken individually, each site possesses certain properties, but activated simultaneously, according to the text, they create something greater, a combined effect that transcends the sum of its parts. Above them, the footsteps they had heard in the warehouse had ceased, and the silence felt oppressive, weighted with expectation. Watson found himself straining to hear any sound that might indicate pursuit or discovery, his soldier's instincts alert for danger. Yet the silence remained unbroken, save for their own breathing, their own small movements within this chamber that had waited in darkness for unknown years to be discovered once again. A piece of stone, dislodged from where they had descended, perhaps, or loosened by their passage, fell somewhere in the cellar beyond the chamber, the sound sharp and startling in the stillness. All 3 men turned toward the doorway, but nothing appeared. No pursuer emerged from the shadows. Yet the sense of being watched persisted, of eyes observing from the darkness just beyond the lantern's reach, patient, curious, waiting to see what these intruders would do, now that they had found what the manuscript had guided them to discover. Holmes withdrew his pocket watch, checking the time in the lantern light. 7:30. We should examine what we can here, then retreat to safer ground for discussion and planning. Professor, note the measurements if you would. We shall want to create our own diagrams, comparing all 3 sites. Looking for patterns or correspondences the manuscript might not explicitly state. They worked methodically for the next quarter hour, Watson holding the lantern, while Holmes and Blackwood measured and sketched, their voices low as they discussed what they observed, theories forming and reforming as new details emerged. The chamber yielded its secrets slowly, marks on the walls suggesting where torches had once burned, stains on the floor within the circle where substances had been poured or spilled, and carved into the underside of one pillar, almost hidden, a date, October 29th, 1666. The Great Fire of London, Watson breathed, recognizing the year. October was after the fire, during the rebuilding, or during the chaos that followed, Holmes added, when authorities were overwhelmed with reconstruction, when attention was focused elsewhere, an ideal time for secret work to proceed unnoticed. Perhaps this chamber was constructed then, or perhaps it was renovated, adapted from something even older. Either way, that date suggests this has been planned for a very long time indeed. The lantern flickered, its oil running low, and Holmes made the decision to depart while they still had light to navigate the cellar's maze. They retraced their steps carefully, ascending the wooden stairs back into the warehouse proper, finding it empty, silent, whoever had moved above having departed or concealed themselves too well to be discovered. Outside, full night had fallen, and the fog had thickened until the street lamps glowed like distant moons, seen through layers of gauze. Their light diffused and softened until it seemed almost dreamlike, as though they had emerged not into London proper, but into some parallel version of the city, where familiar landmarks remained, but rendered strange by atmosphere and shadow, by knowing what they now knew about what lay beneath familiar surfaces, what ancient purposes persisted in the darkness below streets where ordinary people walked, unaware of the mysteries that slept beneath their feet, waiting with the patience of stone for their appointed hour to awaken. They found a coffee house still open on the commercial road, its windows streaming with condensation that caught and diffused the gaslight within, creating an impression of warmth that drew them inside like moths to flame. The interior smelled of coffee and pipe tobacco, of damp wool drying near a stove, of bread toasted over coals, ordinary scents that seemed almost miraculous after the warehouse cellar's oppressive atmosphere. A few other patrons occupied corner tables, speaking in low voices over newspapers or ledgers, paying no attention to three men who entered looking dishevelled and thoughtful, who settled at a table near the back and ordered coffee strong enough to clear the fog from both the air and their minds. Watson wrapped his hands around the heavy ceramic cup when it arrived, letting the heat seep into his fingers, watching steam rise in delicate spirals that caught the light and disappeared into the smoky air above their heads. Holmes sat motionless except for his eyes, which moved constantly, taking in the other patrons, the exits, the shadows that gathered in corners beyond the reach of lamps, hung at intervals along the walls. Professor Blackwood had spread his notes across the table, weighing down the pages with salt cellar and sugar bowl to prevent them curling in the humid air, and now studied his own handwriting as though the answers he sought might be hidden between the words, waiting for the right perspective to render them visible. 3 sights, Holmes said finally, his voice barely above a murmur, pitched to reach his companions without carrying to neighbouring tables. 3 ritual chambers, constructed or adapted according to identical principles, positioned to form a geometric pattern across London. The manuscript provides their locations and describes their purpose: to create, through combined activation, what it terms a great opening. A doorway between this world and others. The question that occupies me now is not whether this is possible, for I confess I have ceased to know what possibilities reality permits. Rather, I wonder who intends to activate these sites, and whether the manuscript was sent to Professor Blackwood as warning or invitation. A log shifted in the stove with a sound like a sigh, sending sparks up the flue, and the coffee house proprietor moved to add more coal, his movements practiced, economical, the routine actions of a man who had performed this task 10,000 times, and would perform it 10,000 more. Watson found himself envying that certainty, that life bounded by comprehensible duties and predictable outcomes, where mystery meant no more than wondering whether rain would come tomorrow, whether business would improve in the spring. The third location, Blackwood said, his finger tracing lines on his diagrams, lies directly beneath the British Museum, beneath the reading room where I have worked for nearly 4 decades. If the pattern holds, there will be a chamber there as well, and I suspect I know where it must be. There are stories, rumours really, that the museum was constructed over much older foundations, that Roman structures underlie the current building, and beneath those, perhaps, structures older still. When they excavated for the reading room's foundation, workers reported finding passages that led deeper than the plans accounted for, spaces that were filled with rubble rather than explored. At the time, this seemed merely prudent. One cannot investigate every anomaly when construction schedules press forward. But now, I wonder what was buried, what was deliberately concealed. Holmes produced a pencil and began sketching on a clean page of his notebook, his hand moving with swift confidence as he rendered London in simplified form, marking the 3 locations they had identified, drawing lines between them. The resulting triangle, as he had noted before, centered roughly on the area around Covent Garden, and within that triangle lay numerous sites of historical significance. Ancient churches, the remains of Roman walls, buildings whose foundations reached back through centuries of accumulated construction, each generation building upon the ruins of what came before. London, rising gradually like sediment deposited by a river that flowed through time rather than space. Tomorrow, we must gain access to the museum's lower levels, Holmes continued, his pencil adding notations to the sketch. Professor, you can facilitate this more easily than anyone. You have the authority, the familiarity with the building's layout, and the trust of the staff. Watson and I will accompany you as consultants investigating historical architecture, and we will search until we find what the manuscript tells us must be there. The coffee grew cold in Watson's cup as they talked, planning their approach, discussing what they had learned and what remained unknown. Other patrons departed gradually, until only they remained with the proprietor, who had retreated behind his counter, and sat reading a penny dreadful, content to let them occupy his establishment as long as they wished, the coffee-house's warm sanctuary available to all who needed refuge from the October night's increasing chill. Somewhere a clock struck 9, its chimes muffled by the coffee-house walls, but still audible, marking time's steady progression toward that date the manuscript had specified, October 29th, now only 4 days distant. Watson found himself calculating hours remaining, wondering what exactly was supposed to occur when that moment arrived, whether anything would happen at all, or whether they pursued elaborate fantasy, medieval delusion dressed in convincing trappings but ultimately empty of genuine power. Yet the chambers they had found argued against dismissing this as simple fantasy. Someone had gone to extraordinary effort, had commanded significant resources, had maintained knowledge across centuries with purpose and precision that suggested absolute conviction in what they were attempting. Holmes folded his notebook and rose, settling his account with the proprietor, and they emerged once more into fog that had grown denser still, reducing visibility until even gas lamps became vague suggestions of illumination, ghosts of light haunting an increasingly ghostly city. They walked together toward a major thoroughfare where cabs might be found, their footsteps echoing strangely in the muffled air, each sound seeming to travel in unexpected directions, bouncing off invisible walls of vapor until even their own progress became difficult to track by ear alone. They found a cab at last, its driver hunched in his seat, with collar turned up against the damp, his horse standing patient and resigned to whatever demands the night might make. Holmes gave the Baker Street address, and they climbed inside, grateful for the enclosed space, small and cramped as it was, that offered at least the illusion of security. The journey home passed in silence, each man occupied with his own thoughts, processing what they had discovered, preparing mentally for whatever tomorrow's investigation might reveal. Baker Street welcomed them with the amber glow of Mrs. Hudson's lamps still burning in the lower windows, and they found her waiting with tea and sandwiches, having anticipated their return regardless of the hour. Bless that woman, Watson thought, who maintained the illusion of domestic normalcy even when her lodgers pursued investigations that stretched rationality's boundaries, who asked no questions but provided exactly what was needed, who understood that sometimes men required sanctuary more than they required explanations. They ate in the familiar comfort of their rooms, the fire rebuilt to chase away the chill they had brought in from the fog-wrapped streets. The tea steamed in delicate cups, the sandwiches disappeared with grateful efficiency, and gradually the tension that had accumulated over the day's discoveries began to ease, not disappearing entirely, but settling into something more manageable, less acute. Watson found himself yawning despite the late hour's coffee, his body asserting its needs regardless of his mind's continued agitation. Holmes stood by the window, looking down into the street where fog pressed against the glass like something alive, something seeking entry. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we complete our survey of the 3 sites. We confirm that the manuscript's information is entirely accurate, that whoever sent it to Professor Blackwood possessed comprehensive knowledge of these hidden chambers. And then we must make our decision. Do we attempt to prevent whatever is planned for October 29th? Or do we observe and document what occurs? For if there is even the smallest possibility that these rituals achieve what they claim, we will witness something that transforms human understanding of reality itself. Can we justify interfering with such discovery, even if we fear its consequences?" Watson had no answer. His medical training, his military service, his years of investigation alongside Holmes, none of these experiences had prepared him for questions like these, for choices between caution and curiosity, when the stakes might be nothing less than the boundaries that separated sane from insane, possible from impossible, the world they knew from worlds that might exist beyond knowing. The fire crackled softly, a log settling with a shower of sparks, and outside the fog pressed closer, transforming London into a city of whispers and suggestions, where solid things grew uncertain, where the familiar became strange, where 3 men sat in warm rooms, considering mysteries that had waited centuries for this particular moment, this convergence of knowledge and circumstance that might, 4 days hence, culminate in something extraordinary, or in nothing at all. And the only way to know with certainty was to follow this investigation to whatever conclusion awaited, whether that conclusion brought enlightenment or danger, or perhaps both together, inseparable as fog from the darkness it concealed. Professor Blackwood had fallen asleep in his chair, the leather case still clutched against his chest, his breathing deep and regular, exhaustion finally overcoming the anxiety that had driven him through the day's discoveries. Holmes covered him gently with a blanket, then turned to Watson with a small smile. "We should all rest while we can. Tomorrow brings the final piece of this puzzle, and I suspect the museum's secrets will prove most significant of all. Whatever we find beneath that great temple to human knowledge, it will tell us whether we face elaborate fantasy or genuine discovery. Either way, we will know, and knowledge, whatever its content, is always preferable to ignorance shrouded in comfortable illusion." Watson nodded, too weary for further discussion, and retired to his own room, where sleep came surprisingly quickly, despite the day's strangeness, despite the questions that remained unanswered, despite everything they had learned about chambers hidden beneath London's surface, about manuscripts that spoke impossibilities, about dates approaching when boundaries might thin and doorways might open into spaces where maps offered no guidance, and ordinary laws held uncertain dominion over what might exist beyond the veils that separated world from world, reality from whatever other realities might press against it from the other side, patient as the fog that wrapped the city in its grey embrace, waiting for the barriers to weaken, waiting for the moment when crossing might be possible, when what had been sealed away might return again into the light. Grey dawnlight filtered through Baker Street's windows, finding Watson's windows, finding Watson already dressed and standing at the breakfast table, buttering toast with mechanical precision, while his mind remained fixed on the day's approaching task. He had slept fitfully, his dreams populated by stone circles and shifting symbols, by doorways that opened onto spaces his sleeping mind could not properly render, leaving him with fragmentary impressions of vastness and impossible geometries that dissolved upon waking like fog touched by sunrise. Holmes emerged from his bedroom, looking surprisingly refreshed, as though the prospect of completing their investigation energized, rather than troubled him. His grey eyes bright with anticipation as he accepted the coffee Mrs. Hudson poured, with her usual quiet efficiency. Professor Blackwood had departed an hour earlier to make arrangements at the museum, to ensure their access to the lower levels would proceed without bureaucratic obstacles or unwanted attention from colleagues who might question why he brought consultants to examine foundations rather than artifacts. The plan was simple. They would meet him at the staff entrance at 10 o'clock, armed with lanterns and measuring tools, presenting themselves as structural assessors, investigating reports of settling in the reading room's floor, a plausible fiction that would grant them freedom to explore whatever passages led downward into the building's concealed depths. The morning passed slowly, minutes stretching like honey from a spoon, and Watson found himself repeatedly checking his pocket watch, as though willing time to accelerate toward the appointed hour. Holmes occupied himself with his chemical apparatus, conducting some experiment whose purpose Watson did not inquire about, content to let his friend pursue whatever tangential investigations occupied the spaces between more pressing mysteries. The familiar smell of reagents and burning alcohol filled the rooms, acetic acid and sulfur, copper compounds heated until they released strange-colored vapors that Holmes carefully captured in glass vessels, his movements precise, his attention absolute. At 9:30 they departed, taking a cab through streets that had shaken off yesterday's fog to reveal a London washed clean by rain. its buildings standing sharp against pale sky, its pavements still damp but navigable without the previous day's treacherous slickness. The British Museum rose before them with its imposing facade, that great columned entrance suggesting a Greek temple transported through time and space to serve as guardian for humanity's collected knowledge and curiosities. They found Blackwood waiting as arranged, and he led them through corridors Watson had walked before during previous visits, though never with such purpose, never seeking secrets rather than scholarship. The reading room stood silent at this early hour, its great circular space empty of the readers, who would arrive later to bend over manuscripts and folios, pursuing their own investigations into history's accumulated mysteries. The domed ceiling soared overhead, creating acoustic properties that made their footsteps echo with strange clarity, each sound seeming to linger longer than natural before fading into the stillness that accumulated in this space, dedicated to silence and study. Blackwood led them past the main reading desks toward a door marked for staff only, producing a key that turned in the lock with a click that seemed disproportionately loud. Stairs descended beyond that door, narrow and utilitarian, lacking the grandeur of the museum's public spaces. These were working passages, meant for servants and maintenance staff, for those who kept the great institution functioning, but remained invisible to the visitors who walked above. The air grew cooler as they descended, took on that underground quality Watson had come to recognize, that particular combination of dampness and stillness that characterized spaces removed from sun and weather, from the surface world's constant flux. Their lanterns cast wavering light across whitewashed walls, creating shadows that danced and merged as they progressed downward through one landing, then another, going deeper than Watson would have thought necessary for a building's normal functioning. At the third landing, Blackwood paused before what appeared to be solid wall, though, when Holmes examined it closely, he found what Watson now expected: mortar that differed subtly from the surrounding material, joints that suggested this section had been added or modified after the original construction. A maintenance cupboard stood nearby, and from it Blackwood retrieved tools wrapped in oilcloth, a hammer and chisel, pry bar and wedges, cached there earlier in preparation for this moment. The work of opening the concealed passage proceeded more quickly than at St. Dunstan's, perhaps because they now knew what to expect, perhaps because the wall here had been constructed more recently, its mortar not yet hardened to stone-like consistency by centuries of settling. Within 20 minutes, they had created an opening large enough to pass through, and that familiar scent emerged: sandalwood and myrrh and something else, stronger here than at the previous sites, almost overwhelming in its intensity, until Watson had to step back, his eyes watering, his medical instincts screaming, warning about substances that could affect consciousness, that could induce visions, or delirium, or worse, consequences he preferred not to contemplate. Holmes pressed a handkerchief to his face before entering, and Watson and Blackwood did likewise, the cloth providing minimal protection, but better than breathing that atmosphere unfiltered. The passage beyond led downward at a sharp angle, cut through bedrock in places, following what must have been a natural fissure in places, and expanded through human effort in others. The walls here bore marks of great age, tool marks from implements that predated modern steel, water staining that spoke of centuries of slow seepage, and in one place, carved so faint it was nearly invisible, Roman numerals that dated to the 1st century after Christ. A sound echoed up from below, not the sound of falling stone or dripping water, but something else, something rhythmic and deliberate, like fabric rustling or perhaps breathing, though whose breath it might be, Watson could not begin to guess. Holmes paused, listening intently, then continued forward with increased caution, moving more slowly, placing each foot with care to minimize sound. They descended perhaps 50 feet through the passage, before it opened into a chamber that dwarfed the previous sights in both size and evident importance. The space stretched before them like a subterranean cathedral, its ceiling lost in darkness above the reach of their lantern light, its walls carved from living rock and covered with symbols so densely packed they seemed to writhe and flow like living script. At the chamber's center stood the largest ritual circle they had yet encountered, 40 feet in diameter at Watson's estimation, composed of that same dark stone veined with quartz. But here the veins had been filled with something that glowed faintly with its own phosphorescence, creating a network of light that pulsed slowly, almost as though the stone itself breathed. Around this central circle stood 12 pillars, each carved with such elaborate detail that comprehending their full decoration would require hours of study. And between these pillars stretched visible connections, not physical chains, but something else, distortions in the air itself that made vision waver, that suggested forces or energies contained and directed by the pillars' arrangement. Professor Blackwood's lantern slipped from his nerveless fingers, the glass chimney shattering against stone with a sound like a cry, like something breaking that could never be repaired. The sudden noise and darkness where his light had been shocked them all, and in that moment of confusion, Watson saw something that made his breath catch. Shadows moving along the chamber's far wall, shadows that possessed no corresponding objects to cast them, that moved independently of any light source, flowing across the carved stone like oil spreading across water. Holmes had seen them too, Watson realized, for his friend stood frozen, watching those impossible shadows with an expression caught between scientific fascination and something approaching genuine fear. "We are not alone here," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying strange resonance in the chamber's acoustics, seeming to echo from multiple directions simultaneously. Whatever this chamber was designed to contain or contact, it has been activated already. The ritual has begun. As if in response to his words, the phosphorescent veins in the great circle began to pulse more rapidly, their light intensifying until Watson could see the chamber's full extent without need for lanterns, could see the 12 pillars in their complete detail, could see the walls rising to a vaulted ceiling covered in astronomical charts, rendered in precious metals that still gleamed despite their age, could see what stood at the chamber's far end, where the shadows had been moving. An altar rose there, or something that served altar's function, carved from a single block of obsidian that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, and upon it rested an object. Watson's mind struggled to categorize, neither entirely book nor entirely sculpture, neither wholly organic nor entirely artificial, something that existed in the space between categories, that seemed to shift its fundamental nature depending on the angle from which one viewed it. The manuscript, Watson realized with sudden certainty. Not the copy Blackwood had received, but the original, the source from which all other texts had been derived, resting here in this chamber for centuries, or perhaps millennia. waiting patient as stone for the moment when boundaries would thin and communication might be possible between this world and others that pressed against it from beyond sight. Holmes approached the altar slowly, his movements dreamlike, as though he walked through water rather than air, and Watson followed despite every instinct that screamed to flee, to abandon this investigation, to return to surface and sunlight, and the comfortable certainties of a world where such things as they now witnessed could not exist. But scientific training warred with primitive fear, and training won. Barely, reluctantly, but it won, driving him forward to stand beside Holmes at the altar's edge, looking down at the impossible object that rested there. "It is not entirely in our dimension," Holmes murmured, his voice distant, abstracted. "See how its edges blur, how it seems to extend into spaces we cannot properly perceive. This is what they sought, what they created, not merely knowledge recorded on parchment, but knowledge made physical, given form that transcends ordinary matter, that exists simultaneously in multiple states, multiple locations, serving as anchor and beacon for whatever they hoped to summon or contact." The chamber's light continued to intensify, the pulsing rhythm growing faster, and Watson felt something building in the air itself, a pressure or presence that made breathing difficult, that seemed to press against his consciousness from directions that had no names, that suggested spaces existed beyond the 3 dimensions his senses normally perceived. The shadows on the walls had multiplied, dozens now, perhaps hundreds, moving in patterns that might have been language, or might have been something else entirely, some form of communication that operated according to principles unknown to human linguistics. Professor Blackwood had collapsed to his knees, whether from fear or awe, Watson could not determine, his hands pressed against the stone floor, his head bowed as though in prayer or submission. And standing there in that impossible chamber, beneath the British Museum, beneath the accumulated knowledge of human civilization, Watson understood with terrible clarity that they had discovered something that should perhaps have remained hidden, that some doors were sealed not to keep secrets in, but to keep those who might misuse them out, and that by following this investigation to its conclusion, they had opened pathways that might prove impossible to close again. The light reached a crescendo, became almost blinding in its intensity, and in that moment of maximum illumination, Watson saw clearly what the shadows were, what had been trying to communicate through their movements on the walls. They were warnings, recorded by those who had built this chamber and then sealed it away. Warnings about what would happen on October 29th, when planetary alignments would strengthen the ritual circles, when the 3 sites would resonate in harmony, when doorways might open that had been closed since before human memory began its halting record of time's passage. And the message the shadows wrote, over and over in languages both ancient and eternal, was simple and terrible. Do not let them through. The light faded as suddenly as it had intensified, leaving them in darkness, broken only by Holmes's lantern, its familiar glow seeming almost inadequate after the phosphorescent brilliance that had filled the chamber. Mom had filled the chamber moments before. Watson found himself breathing heavily, his heart racing with the kind of primal fear he had not experienced since Afghanistan, when artillery shells had fallen around his position, and survival became a matter of chance rather than choice. Beside him, Holmes stood perfectly still, his face unreadable in the lantern's uncertain light, his eyes fixed on the altar where the impossible manuscript rested, now appearing as nothing more than an ancient book, its edges solid and comprehensible, its mystery concealed once more beneath the appearance of ordinary matter. Professor Blackwood rose slowly from the floor, his legs trembling, his hands brushing dust from his trousers with automatic movements that suggested his conscious mind remained elsewhere, processing what they had witnessed, trying to reconcile impossible observations with a lifetime's accumulation of rational understanding. The shadows had vanished from the walls, leaving only carved stone and the faint traces of mineral deposits that gleamed dully where water had seeped through cracks over uncounted years. The chamber felt different now, emptier somehow, as though whatever presence had manifested during those moments of intense illumination had withdrawn, retreating back into whatever spaces it normally inhabited, leaving only echoes of its passage impressed upon the air itself. Watson needed no encouragement to depart that chamber, to retrace their steps through the passage that led upward toward the museum's normal levels, toward spaces where electric lights burned with steady, comprehensible glow, where the air smelled of dust and old paper rather than myrrh and stranger substances, where reality maintained its familiar contours without the disturbing suggestions of depths and dimensions that lurked beneath comfortable surfaces. They emerged into the storage level, gasping like men who had held their breath underwater, grateful for ordinary air, for the mundane architecture of brick and mortar that surrounded them with blessed normality. Blackwood sealed the opening they had created, working with desperate efficiency, his hands shaking, but his determination unwavering. "No one else must enter there," he muttered as he worked, mixing fresh mortar with water from a maintenance bucket, spreading it across the breach with a trowel whose scraping sounds seemed almost musical in their ordinariness. Not until we understand what we're dealing with, not until we can ensure that curiosity doesn't lead someone to trigger something catastrophic through innocent ignorance. They returned to Baker Street in a cab whose normalcy felt surreal after the morning's discoveries, watching London pass by the windows, shopkeepers opening for the day's business, flower sellers arranging their displays, children running errands while dogs followed hopefully at their heels. The entire magnificent ordinary circus of urban life proceeding in complete ignorance of what lurked beneath their feet, of chambers where ancient knowledge waited, patient as stone, for moments, when stars aligned properly and doorways might be opened between worlds. Watson found himself envying that ignorance, wishing he could unknow what he had learned, could return to a state where mystery meant nothing more than unidentified footprints in a garden, where the extraordinary remained firmly bounded by physical law and rational explanation. Mrs. Hudson met them at the door, her face showing concern at their dishevelled appearance. And without being asked, she brought tea and sandwiches, understanding that sometimes men needed sustenance and comfort more than they needed questions or explanations. They ate in silence at first, the simple acts of chewing and swallowing helping to ground them back in bodies that required fuel, that operated according to comprehensible biological principles, rather than the mysterious energies they had witnessed in the museum's depths. Holmes stood eventually and moved to his desk, withdrawing the diagrams and notes they had accumulated over the past days, spreading them across the surface in careful arrangement. "October 29th, he said, his voice steady now, restored to its normal analytical tone. 3 days hence, according to the manuscript, on that date, specific astronomical conditions will occur. A conjunction of planets visible from London, a particular phase of moon, celestial mechanics that create optimal circumstances for whatever the ritual is designed to accomplish. The three chambers serve as focusing points, creating a triangular field of influence centered on the old Templar church. If the ritual is conducted simultaneously at all three sites, the manuscript claims that barriers will thin, that communication, or even transit between dimensions, will become temporarily possible. Watson joined him at the desk, studying the diagrams with eyes that now understood what they depicted, not as historical curiosity, but as functional architecture, structures designed with specific purposes that transcended mere shelter or storage. The question, Watson said slowly, is whether we believe this is actually possible, or whether we are dealing with elaborate delusion maintained across centuries by people who believed in something that has no basis in physical reality. That is indeed the question, Holmes agreed, though I confess the evidence increasingly suggests the former rather than the latter. The chambers exist precisely where the manuscript indicated. The symbols and arrangements match descriptions with perfect accuracy. The manuscript itself, or rather, the original we encountered this morning, displayed properties that I cannot explain through conventional understanding of matter and energy. And most significantly, something responded to our presence in that chamber. The shadows, the light, the sense of pressure and presence. These were not hallucinations, for we all experienced them simultaneously, which suggests external reality rather than internal delusion. Professor Blackwood had been sitting quietly in his chair, but now he spoke, his voice thoughtful. There is another possibility we have not considered. Perhaps the manuscript was sent to me, not as warning or invitation, but as test. Perhaps someone wishes to see how we respond, what choices we make when confronted with knowledge of this nature. The courier's delivery, the timing 3 days before the optimal date, these suggest deliberate orchestration rather than random chance. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion, and Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing an envelope on a silver tray, her expression suggesting the delivery had been unusual. "This was just brought by messenger," she said, handing it to Holmes. "A boy, perhaps 12 years old, who refused payment and ran off before I could question him about who had sent him." Holmes examined the envelope, expensive paper, unmarked, save for his name written in elegant script across the front. He opened it carefully, withdrawing a single sheet that bore only a few lines of text. "Mr. Holmes, you have found what was meant to be found. Now you must choose. On October 29th, at the hour of midnight, those who know will gather at the 3 sites. You are invited to observe, to witness, to understand, or you may attempt to prevent what centuries of preparation have made inevitable. Either choice serves our purposes, for knowledge seeks those capable of receiving it, regardless of whether they approach as students or adversaries. The doorway will open. What comes through depends entirely on who stands ready to receive. The letter bore no signature, no indication of its author's identity. Holmes passed it to Watson, who read it twice before handing it to Blackwood, and all three sat in silence as afternoon light moved gradually across the floor, marking time's passage toward a date that now loomed with ominous significance, when choices would be required that none of them felt prepared to make, when the comfortable distance between theory and practice would collapse entirely. leaving them standing at the threshold of something that might transform human understanding, or might reveal nothing but the final elaborate chapter of a delusion, maintained across centuries by those who desperately wished it to be true. Watson moved to the window, watching carriages pass in the street below, watching ordinary people pursuing ordinary lives. And he thought about responsibility, about the weight that came with knowing things others did not know, about the choices one made when standing between common ignorance and dangerous knowledge. Part of him wanted to alert authorities, to share this burden with police and government officials who possessed power to seal chambers and prevent gatherings. But what would he tell them? That symbols carved in stone might open doorways to other dimensions, that medieval rituals retained genuine power. They would think him mad, would dismiss his claims as fantastic delusion, and the ritual would proceed anyway, while he was confined to an asylum for observation. "We must attend," Holmes said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched across minutes. "We must observe what occurs on October 29th, must document and understand to the best of our abilities. For if this is genuine, if doorways can indeed be opened, if other realms exist beyond the boundaries of our normal perception, then humanity deserves to know. And if it is elaborate theatre, convincing performance without substance, then we will have that knowledge as well, and can put this matter to rest once and for all." "And if something comes through?" Watson asked quietly. "Something dangerous or malevolent or simply incomprehensible? What then? Do we bear responsibility for whatever consequences follow from our choice to observe rather than prevent?" Holmes met his eyes steadily. "We bear that responsibility regardless, whether we attempt to stop the ritual or merely witness it, whether we succeed in prevention or fail, whether we gather knowledge or remain in ignorance. All paths carry consequences. All choices create outcomes we cannot fully predict. I choose knowledge over ignorance, observation over blind intervention. But I will not compel you to share that choice. If you wish to alert authorities, to attempt prevention through official channels, I will support that decision, even as I pursue my own course." Watson considered this, weighing his instincts against his curiosity, his caution against his loyalty to his friend, and their shared pursuit of truth, wherever it might lead. "No," he said finally. "No, I will stand with you. Whatever comes through that doorway, if anything comes through at all, we will face it together, as we have faced everything else these years have brought us." The afternoon deepened toward evening, and they continued their planning, their discussion, their attempts to prepare for something that by its very nature defied preparation. Maps were consulted, arrangements were made, contingencies were discussed with the understanding that contingencies meant little when dealing with forces or entities that operated according to unknown principles. October 29th approached with the inevitability of tide or season, and they could only wait, only prepare as best their limited understanding allowed, only hope that whatever they witnessed in 3 days' time would yield to observation and analysis, would prove comprehensible even if extraordinary, would fit somehow into the expanding boundaries of what they were willing to accept as possible, in a universe that clearly contained more mysteries than their philosophy had previously acknowledged, or their science had yet learned to measure. Night fell gently across London, gas lamps blooming one by one along the streets, creating pools of light that pushed back darkness without ever quite defeating it. And in rooms at 221B Baker Street, 3 men sat planning for midnight 3 days hence, when they would stand in underground chambers and watch as others attempted to open doorways that had remained sealed for reasons lost to history, when boundaries might thin and the impossible might briefly intrude upon the ordinary world, leaving it forever changed, or leaving nothing changed, except the understanding of those few who witnessed, who stood at thresholds between one state of knowledge and another, waiting for revelation or disappointment, or something else entirely, something for which their language had no adequate terms, and their experience provided no useful analogies, something that waited patient as the stars above for its appointed hour to arrive. October 29th arrived not with drama, but with quiet persistence, the sun rising over London as it had risen for millennia, indifferent to human rituals or cosmic alignments, casting its ornaments, casting its ordinary light across rooftops and chimney pots with the same impartial generosity it offered to every morning, regardless of what significance humans might attach to particular dates. Watson woke to find Holmes already standing at the window, still wearing yesterday's clothes, suggesting he had not slept at all, but had spent the night in that state of intense contemplation that sometimes possessed him when investigation approached its climax, when all pieces of a puzzle finally revealed their relationships, and the picture hidden within their arrangement became suddenly, startlingly clear. The day unfolded with strange duality, outwardly ordinary in every respect, the city conducting its usual business with no awareness that this date held any significance beyond its place in the calendar's orderly progression. Yet, underneath that normalcy ran currents of anticipation and preparation that Watson felt thrumming through his own nerves, like low-frequency vibrations, just below the threshold of hearing. They took breakfast in near silence, the familiar ritual of toast and marmalade, eggs and coffee, providing comfort through repetition, through the body's simple needs, asserting themselves, regardless of what mysteries the coming night might bring. Mrs. Hudson seemed to sense something unusual in the air, her glances toward them carrying questions she was too discreet to voice, and Watson found himself grateful for her tact, for the preservation of normalcy, even when normalcy felt increasingly like performance, like theatre conducted for an audience that remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding behind familiar scenes. Professor Blackwood arrived at noon, carrying a leather satchel containing lanterns and notebooks, tools for observation and documentation should anything occur worth recording. His face showed the strain of 3 sleepless nights, but his eyes held determination born of scholarly commitment to understanding regardless of cost, that peculiar courage possessed by those who value knowledge above comfort, who will venture into unknown territories simply because they are unknown and therefore demand investigation. They reviewed their plans one final time. They would position themselves in the museum chamber, the most central of the 3 sites, where they might observe without interfering, might witness whatever occurred or failed to occur when midnight arrived, and those who maintained this centuries-old tradition attempted their ritual. The afternoon passed with dreamlike slowness, minutes stretching like shadows as the sun arced across London's sky, marking hours with its steady progression toward the horizon where it would sink and yield the world to darkness. Watson found himself unable to read, unable to concentrate on anything beyond the approaching evening, his mind circling endlessly around questions that had no answers until events provided them. What would they witness? Would anything happen at all? Or would midnight pass like any other midnight, revealing the entire mystery as elaborate delusion maintained by believers whose faith exceeded their contact with reality. And if something did occur, if the ritual succeeded in its claimed purpose, what exactly would success look like? What form would entities from other dimensions take? How would doorways manifest between worlds? Holmes spent the afternoon in his chemical laboratory, though Watson suspected the experiment served more to occupy hands and mind than to pursue any specific investigation. The familiar sounds drifted through the rooms, glass clinking against glass, liquid pouring, the soft hiss of Bunsen burners heating solutions to precise temperatures. These sounds carried their own comfort, their promise that whatever strangeness the night might bring, the world of measurable phenomena and reproducible results would remain available, would continue offering its certainties, even if those certainties proved insufficient to encompass all that existence contained. Dusk arrived, painted in shades of amber and gold. The October sun sinking through layers of atmosphere that transformed its light into colours that seemed almost supernatural in their intensity, as though the day itself prepared for extraordinary evening, decorating its departure with splendour usually reserved for special occasions. Watson stood at the window, watching darkness gather in the streets below, watching gas lamps bloom one by one as lamplighters made their rounds, maintaining London's illumination against the encroaching night. Somewhere in this vast city, others prepared for midnight. The inheritors of that medieval tradition, whoever they might be, making their own arrangements, travelling to the 3 ritual sites with implements and knowledge accumulated across generations, ready to test once more whether barriers between worlds could be made permeable through proper combination of symbol and substance, intention and astronomical circumstance. They departed Baker Street at 11 o'clock, the night cool and clear, stars visible overhead in gaps between buildings, creating a celestial map that ancient astronomers had studied and interpreted, finding in stellar patterns the guidance they sought for earthly activities. The cab carried them through streets growing quieter as respectable London retired for the evening, leaving the night to those whose business or inclinations called them forth in darkness. The British Museum rose before them, its facade dark except for minimal lighting, its doors locked against casual entry. But Blackwood possessed keys, possessed authority to access the building at any hour, and they entered through a side entrance, their footsteps echoing in corridors empty of the crowds that filled them during daylight hours. They descended through familiar passages toward the hidden chamber, moving with confidence born of previous visits, needing little light to navigate stairs and turns they had memorized. The breach in the wall stood open. Blackwood had removed the temporary repairs earlier in the day, and they passed through into that ancient passage carved through bedrock, descending once more into depths where London's modern infrastructure gave way to much older structures, to spaces that had existed before the city above had dreamed its current form. The great chamber waited in darkness, though, as they entered, Watson noticed immediately that the phosphorescent veins in the ritual circle were already glowing softly, pulsing with that slow rhythm that suggested breathing, that implied the chamber itself possessed something approaching awareness, or at least sensitivity, to the approaching hour. They positioned themselves along the western wall, setting their lanterns low so as not to interfere with whatever might occur, arranging themselves as observers, as witnesses to events they would document but not direct. Silence settled around them, profound and expectant, broken only by their own breathing and the occasional drip of water from somewhere in the chamber's heights. Watson checked his pocket watch. 11:37. 23 minutes until midnight. 23 minutes until they discovered whether centuries of preparation and belief would culminate in genuine phenomenon, or reveal themselves as elaborate delusion, convincing only to those whose faith made them willing to interpret ambiguous evidence as confirmation. A sound drew their attention toward the passage through which they had entered. Footsteps approaching, multiple sets, moving with unhurried confidence. Holmes's hand moved to Watson's arm, a gesture requesting stillness, observation without intervention. The footsteps grew louder, and presently figures emerged into the chamber, 7 of them, robed in dark fabric that absorbed rather than reflected light, their faces concealed by hoods that cast their features into shadow. They moved with practiced coordination to positions around the great circle, each standing at one of the marked points, and Watson realized with a start that the chamber could accommodate 12 such positions, that these 7 represented only partial participation in whatever ritual the space was designed to facilitate. One of the figures, taller than the others, standing at the circle's northern point, raised both hands in a gesture that might have been greeting or invocation, and spoke in a voice that carried surprising warmth, lacking any suggestion of the sinister or threatening. "Welcome, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Professor Blackwood. We are grateful for your presence as witnesses. What you observe tonight may challenge everything you believe about reality's boundaries, or it may challenge nothing at all. Either outcome serves truth, which is all any honest seeker can desire." The figure lowered its hood, revealing a woman perhaps 50 years old, with steel-grey hair and eyes that reflected the chamber's phosphorescent glow. Watson recognized intelligence in those eyes, education and thoughtfulness, not the fanaticism he had half expected from practitioners of what authorities would certainly label occult activity. "I am called Sophia," she continued, "and these are my fellow seekers. We maintain a tradition extending back centuries, passed from teacher to student, each generation adding its understanding to what came before. Tonight, we attempt what our predecessors attempted, knowing as they knew that success is measured not in absolute terms, but in degrees of perception, in brief moments when barriers thin and we glimpse what lies beyond them." The phosphorescent veins in the circle had begun pulsing faster, their light intensifying as midnight approached. Watson felt something building in the air itself, that same pressure he had experienced during their previous visit, that sense of presence or potential gathering like storm clouds before lightning strikes. The 7 figures began speaking in unison, their voices blending into harmonics that created strange resonances, sounds that seemed to echo from directions that had no physical location, that suggested dimensions beyond the normal 3. The ritual proceeded with quiet dignity, lacking the dramatic gestures or theatrical presentation Watson had anticipated. Instead, it resembled nothing so much as meditation practiced collectively, a focusing of attention and intention toward a specific purpose, maintained through repetition of phrases in languages Watson did not recognize, through breathing synchronized until the 7 figures seemed to act as single organism, through stillness that paradoxically created motion in the air around them, visible as distortions that made vision waver like heat shimmer on summer pavement. A candle one of the figures had placed at the circle's centre suddenly extinguished itself, its flame snuffed by no visible wind. And in that moment of darkness, something changed. The quality of silence altered, became charged with expectancy, with the sense that whatever separated this world from others had grown thin as paper, transparent as glass, permeable as membranes between cells. The shadows that had appeared during their previous visit returned, but rather than seeming threatening, they moved with curious grace, flowing across walls like ink spreading through water, creating patterns that Watson's mind struggled to interpret as language or communication, or perhaps both simultaneously. Midnight arrived, marked by distant church bells, whose chimes penetrated even these depths, and for a span of perhaps 3 minutes, though Watson could not be certain of time's passage in that space where ordinary rules seemed suspended, the chamber existed in a state Watson had no adequate words to describe. The ritual circle blazed with light that cast no shadows. The pillars hummed with vibrations that resonated in Watson's chest cavity, and through it all those shadows continued their dance, their impossible communication, while the 7 figures stood motionless, their consciousness directed inward or outward, or perhaps both, experiencing something Watson could observe but not share, could witness but not fully comprehend. Then, as gradually as it had intensified, the phenomenon faded. The light dimmed, the vibrations ceased, the shadows withdrew back into whatever spaces they normally inhabited. The 7 figures swayed slightly, emerging from whatever trance state they had entered, and Sophia opened her eyes, looking directly at Holmes with expression that combined exhaustion with profound peace. "You have witnessed what we can achieve," she said softly. "Brief contact, fragmentary communication, glimpses through barriers that remain mostly intact. We do not claim to open permanent doorways, to bring entities fully into this dimension, only to touch, for moments, what exists beyond our normal perception, and to remind ourselves that reality contains more than our limited senses typically reveal." Days would pass before they fully processed what they had observed, before Holmes published his carefully worded account in obscure journals, where it would be read by those prepared to consider its implications, before life returned to its comfortable patterns of ordinary investigation and domestic routine. But standing in their familiar rooms as dawn light filtered through windows, watching London wake to another day, Watson understood that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding. That having glimpsed evidence of depths and dimensions beyond normal perception, he could never quite return to the certainties that had previously governed his worldview. Mystery would always remain, would always beckon from the edges of understanding, inviting exploration, even knowing that complete comprehension might forever elude those bound by 3-dimensional bodies and 5 limited senses. The fire had burned low in the grate, requiring attention, and Watson moved to add fresh coal, the domestic action grounding him back in physical reality, in the simple necessary tasks that constitute daily existence, regardless of what philosophical or metaphysical questions occupy the mind. Outside, London stirred, began its familiar routines, and whatever secrets rested in chambers beneath its streets would wait patient as stone for the next seekers, the next witnesses, the next moment when curiosity overcame caution and drove humans to push against boundaries, to test limits, to reach toward mysteries that shimmer always just beyond comfortable knowledge, promising revelation to those brave enough to look. If you've enjoyed this journey into Gothic mystery and atmospheric wonder, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, to leave a like, to share this story with others who appreciate the strange and beautiful territories where Victorian sensibility meets cosmic speculation, where rational investigation confronts phenomena that resist easy explanation, where the ordinary and extraordinary coexist in perpetual tension that can never be fully resolved, but only explored, documented, wondered about in the quiet hours when sleep approaches and the mind drifts between wakefulness and dream, between solid certainty and fluid possibility. Rest now, dear listener. Let these mysteries settle into your thoughts, like sediment drifting through water. Let them accompany you into sleep, where your own mind will continue the investigation in its own ways. Through its own strange territories, where boundaries dissolve, and impossible things become temporarily possible before morning returns, and the waking world reasserts its familiar rules. Sleep well, dream deep, and know that wonder waits always just beyond the edges of what we think we know, patient and eternal as the stars that wheel overhead, marking time's passage through darkness toward whatever revelations another day might bring. Good night.